I was checking my traps near the edge of the forest when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in these Wyoming mountains, the crying of a child. It was February 1902, and the temperature had dropped so low that most animals had already gone to ground. But there she was, a little girl no more than 7 years old, huddled behind a fallen pine tree, wearing nothing but a thin cotton dress and a locket around her neck. She was shivering so violently, I thought she might break apart. I didn't think twice. I wrapped her in my bearskin coat and carried her back to my cabin. And as we walked through the snow, I noticed something strange. She wasn't asking for her parents. She wasn't crying for help. She was just silent, staring at me with those gray eyes that seemed far too old for her face. My name is Samuel Bridger. I'm 43 years old. And until that frozen afternoon, I thought I knew exactly what my life was. Trapping in these mountains, living alone, avoiding the complications that come with other people. I'd been a trapper for 20 years after leaving behind a life I didn't want to remember in Philadelphia, a life of society expectations, and a woman who chose money over love. These mountains had given me peace, solitude, simplicity. But when I looked at that little girl's face, something shifted inside me, something I thought had frozen solid years ago. The first 3 days she didn't speak at all. She ate the venison stew I made. She slept in the corner of my cabin, wrapped in every blanket I owned. She watched me as I worked on my traps and pelts, but she didn't say a single word. I didn't push her. I'd seen enough trauma in my life to know that words come when they're ready. On the 4th morning, I woke up to find her standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley below. Her hand was clutching that locket around her neck, so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "What's your name?" I asked gently, not expecting an answer. She turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw something break in those gray eyes. "Lily," she whispered. "My name is Lily." It was the first of many small victories. Over the next few weeks, Lily began to open up slowly, like ice melting in spring. She told me she had been traveling with a wagon train, heading west to California. Her father had died 2 years earlier, and her mother had decided to start fresh with relatives in Sacramento. But something had gone wrong. She remembered shouting gunshots, her mother pushing her out of the wagon and telling her to run, to hide in the forest, to not come out no matter what she heard. She had run until her legs gave out. She had hidden for 2 days eating snow and tree bark, and then I found her. I should have taken her to town immediately, reported what had happened, tried to find survivors from the wagon train or locate her relatives, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she looked at me with absolute trust, or maybe it was the selfish part of me that had been alone for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed. I told myself I would wait until spring when the mountain passes cleared, when it would be safer to travel, but deep down I knew I was lying to myself. I was keeping her because for the first time in 20 years, I felt like my life had purpose beyond surviving another winter. Lily adapted to cabin life with surprising ease. She learned to help me prepare pelts, to cook simple meals, to recognize animal tracks in the snow. She was smart, curious, resilient in a way that broke my heart because I knew that kind of resilience only came from experiencing things no child should experience. Every night before bed she would hold that locket and whisper something I couldn't quite hear. And every night I wondered what was inside it. But I never asked because some secrets need to be kept until the keeper is ready to share them. Winter gave way to early spring, and I knew I couldn't delay the inevitable much longer. The mountain passes would clear soon, and I would have to make a decision about Lily's future. But then something happened that changed everything. A man came to my cabin, a sheriff from Laramie named Thomas Garrett. He was investigating the massacre of a wagon train that had been attacked by outlaws 3 months earlier. He had received reports of a missing child, a girl named Lily Harrison, who was believed to have perished in the attack along with her mother and the other travelers. When I told him Lily was alive, that she was living with me, his face went through several expressions: relief, confusion, and then something else, something that made my instincts prickle with warning. He said he would need to take her back to Laramie, that there were procedures to follow, relatives to contact, legal matters to resolve. He said it so smoothly, so officially, that any reasonable person would have simply handed her over. But I've spent 20 years in these mountains reading animal behavior, and this man's behavior was all wrong. He was too interested in seeing her immediately, too insistent that she come with him right away, too focused on that locket around her neck when he thought I wasn't looking. I told him Lily was sleeping, that she had been sick with a fever, that he should come back in a few days when she was stronger. He didn't like that answer, but he couldn't very well force his way into my cabin without cause. So he left, but not before saying something that confirmed all my suspicions. Make sure she keeps that locket safe. It's the only thing she has left of her mother. How did he know about the locket? Lily had been wearing it under her dress, hidden from view. There was no way he could have seen it unless he already knew it existed. And if he knew it existed, then he knew something about what had happened to that wagon train, something he wasn't telling me. After he left, I sat Lily down and asked her something I should have asked months ago. What's inside the locket? She looked at me for a long moment and then slowly opened it. Inside was a small photograph of a woman who must have been her mother and tucked behind. It was a piece of paper folded so small it was almost invisible. She carefully unfolded it and handed it to me. It was a bank certificate, a deposit receipt for $20,000 held in a San Francisco bank under the name Margaret Harrison, Lily's mother. $20,000 in 1902 was enough money to buy a ranch, start a business, live comfortably for years. It was the kind of money that made people do terrible things, kill entire wagon trains, hunt down little girls, pretend to be lawmen. I finally understood why that man had come to my cabin and why he would be back. Lily's mother must have been carrying this certificate when the wagon train was attacked. The outlaws who massacred everyone must have been looking for it. And somehow in the chaos, Lily had escaped with the only proof that the money existed. Without the certificate, whoever killed her mother couldn't access the funds, which meant Lily wasn't just a survivor. She was a witness and a key to a fortune that someone was willing to kill for again. We have to leave, I told her right now. I packed quickly, taking only what we could carry on horseback: my rifle, ammunition, enough food for a week, the furs I could sell in the next town, and the few personal items Lily had. I knew these mountains better than any man alive. I knew trails that hadn't been used in decades, caves that could shelter us from storms, passes that only showed themselves to people who knew where to look. If that man was coming back, and I was certain he would find an empty cabin and no trail to follow. We rode east instead of west, away from Laramie and toward Cheyenne, where I had a friend from my army days. A man I trusted completely, a man who had saved my life once, and who I knew would help us without asking too many questions. It took us 5 days of hard riding, sleeping in the open, staying off main trails, constantly looking over our shoulders, but we made it. My friend's name was Benjamin Cross, and he was now a U.S. Marshal. When I told him the story, his face went hard in a way I remembered from our fighting days. That wasn't a sheriff, Samuel, he said after I described the man who'd come to my cabin. Thomas Garrett died 3 years ago in a shootout with cattle rustlers. Whoever came to see you was using a dead man's name. He made some inquiries through his network of lawmen, and what he discovered confirmed our worst fears. The wagon train massacre had been orchestrated by a gang led by a man named Victor Kane, a former Pinkerton detective who had turned to crime after being dismissed for excessive violence. Kane had learned that one of the passengers on the wagon train was carrying a large sum of money, and he had decided to take it. But he hadn't counted on a 7-year-old girl escaping with the one thing that could give him access to that fortune. Benjamin told me that Kane had been impersonating various law enforcement officials across Wyoming and Colorado trying to locate Lily. He had already killed 2 people who had seen his wanted poster and recognized him. He was desperate, dangerous, and he knew that time was running out because eventually the real authorities would piece together what had happened. "We need to get her to San Francisco," Benjamin said. "Get that money into the proper legal channels. Make sure it goes where Margaret Harrison intended. And once the certificate is processed, Kane will have no reason to hunt her anymore." But getting to San Francisco meant traveling over 1,000 miles through territory where Kane might have associates. It meant exposing Lily to danger every single day. It meant trusting that we could stay ahead of a man who had already proven he would kill without hesitation. "I'll go with you," Benjamin offered. "3 of us have better odds than 2, and I still wear a badge that means something." We left Cheyenne a week later after Benjamin arranged for additional marshals to be notified along our route. We traveled by train when we could, by horse when we couldn't. We stayed in boarding houses under false names. We kept Lily's face hidden under bonnets and scarves. We moved like ghosts through towns and settlements. It should have been straightforward, but nothing ever is when there's that much money involved. We were 3 days outside of Sacramento when they found us, Kane and 4 other men. They cornered us in a narrow canyon where the train had stopped to take on water. Benjamin saw them first. His hand dropped to his gun, and I knew immediately that this was going to end badly. I grabbed Lily and ran, not away from the train, but toward the engine where the crew was working. I figured if I could get her to the engineer, get the train moving, she might have a chance. Benjamin bought us time. I heard gunshots behind me, heard him shouting for us to run, and I ran harder than I had ever run in my life, carrying a 7-year-old girl who had already survived one massacre and didn't deserve to live through another. The engineer saw us coming, saw the men chasing us, and understood immediately what was happening. He started the engine, began building steam, and I literally threw Lily up into the cab before scrambling after her. Benjamin made it too, but he was bleeding from his shoulder. He had taken a bullet covering our escape. As the train began to move, Kane and his men tried to board, but the engineer opened the throttle fully, and we pulled away, leaving them standing in the dust, firing uselessly at a locomotive that was accelerating beyond their reach. We made it to Sacramento that night. Benjamin's shoulder wound was serious, but not fatal, and the next morning we walked into the main branch of Wells Fargo with that certificate and a U.S. Marshal's badge. The bank manager was skeptical at first. Certificates like that were often forged. But after several hours of verification and telegraph communications with San Francisco, they confirmed it was genuine. Margaret Harrison had deposited $20,000 3 years earlier with instructions that if anything happened to her, the money should go to her daughter Lily Harrison and be held in trust until she turned 18. The manager asked us how Margaret had died, and I told him the truth. She died protecting her daughter from men who wanted to steal this money. She died a hero. Over the next few weeks, the legal proceedings moved forward. Kane and his gang were hunted down by federal marshals. 3 were killed in a shootout near Salt Lake City. 2, including Kane, were captured and later hanged for murder and robbery. Benjamin recovered from his wound and went back to his duties in Cheyenne, but not before making me promise to write him with updates about Lily. And Lily, what happened to the little girl who had survived a massacre, who had hidden in the wilderness, who had been hunted by killers? She came to live with me permanently. The court appointed me as her legal guardian. After I petitioned for custody, they investigated my background, found nothing objectionable about an Army veteran turned trapper who had saved a child's life, and granted my request. We went back to my cabin in the mountains, but it was different now. I expanded it, added a proper bedroom for her, built a schoolroom where I taught her reading and mathematics and everything I knew about surviving in the wilderness. The money from her mother's trust fund was managed by the bank. It would be waiting for her when she turned 18, enough to build whatever life she wanted. But what Lily wanted, at least for now, was the simple life we had built together in those mountains. She helped me with my traps, learned to read animal signs, became as comfortable in the wilderness as any mountain man. But she also never forgot her mother. She kept that locket around her neck always. And sometimes I would find her sitting by the window, looking out at the valley, whispering to the photograph inside. 10 years passed. Lily grew from a frightened 7-year-old into a confident young woman. She was 17 now, smart, capable, kind in a way that came from understanding suffering. She had decided she wanted to use her mother's money to open a school for orphans in Laramie, a place where children who had lost everything could find safety and education and hope. It was exactly what her mother would have wanted. We traveled to Laramie together to begin the process of accessing her trust fund and establishing the school. It was strange being back in civilization after so many years in the mountains. Strange seeing how much the town had grown, how much the world had changed while we had been living our quiet life among the pines and peaks. The bank manager who had helped us 10 years earlier was still there, older now but still sharp. He remembered Lily immediately, and tears came to his eyes when he saw the young woman she had become. "Your mother would be so proud," he told her, and I knew it was true. On our last night in Laramie, before returning to the mountains, Lily and I sat on the porch of our hotel, watching the sunset over the distant peaks. She was quiet, reflective, and I knew she was thinking about her mother, about everything that had happened, about the life that stretched ahead of her. "Thank you," she said finally, "for finding me, for keeping me safe, for giving me a home." I didn't respond immediately. What do you say to someone who has become the daughter you never knew you wanted? Someone who had given your life meaning after you had spent 20 years, convinced it had none. "I should be thanking you," I said. "You reminded me that living alone isn't the same as being alive." She smiled and reached up to touch the locket around her neck. The same locket she had been wearing that frozen day in 1902 when I found her behind a fallen tree. "Do you know what I whisper to my mother every night?" she asked. I shook my head. "I tell her I'm okay. I tell her I found someone who loves me the way she loved me. I tell her that her sacrifice wasn't in vain. And then I thank her for pushing me out of that wagon, for making me run, for giving me a chance at life, even though it cost her own." We sat in silence as the stars came out one by one over Laramie. Two people who had found each other in the wilderness, who had survived evil men and harsh winters, who had built something neither of us expected, but both of us needed, a family. The next morning we headed back to the mountains, back to our cabin, back to the life we had chosen together. And as we rode, I thought about all the twists that had brought us to this moment. A scared little girl, a locket with a secret, a man pretending to be a sheriff, a desperate chase across half the country. It had all started with me checking traps on a frozen February morning and hearing a sound that didn't belong, the crying of a child who would change my life forever. Years later, long after Lily had opened her school in Laramie, long after she had married a good man and started a family of her own, she came to visit me in my cabin. She was 32 now, a mother herself, and she brought her daughter to meet me. The little girl was 5 years old with gray eyes that reminded me so much of Lily at that age that I felt my heart skip. "This is your grandfather," Lily told her daughter. The girl looked at me with curiosity and then smiled. The same smile Lily had given me years ago when she finally felt safe enough to trust again. "What's your name?" I asked the little girl. "Margaret," she said proudly. "I'm named after my grandmother, who was very brave." Yes, she was. I told her. Yes, she was. Lily had named her daughter after her mother, keeping the memory alive, honoring the woman who had sacrificed everything so her child could survive. And in that moment, I understood that this was the real treasure, not the $20,000 in the bank, not the school that now educated dozens of orphans, not even the life we had built together in the mountains. The real treasure was legacy, memory, love that transcended death and connected generations. It was knowing that Margaret Harrison's final act of maternal love had created ripples that would continue long after all of us were gone. That night, after Lily and her family left to go back to town, I sat on my porch looking at the stars, just as Lily and I had done 15 years earlier. I was 58 years old now. My hair had gone gray. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be. But I had lived to see something remarkable. I had lived to see a terrified little girl become a woman of strength and purpose. I had lived to see her honor her mother's sacrifice by helping other children who had lost everything. I had lived to see her create her own family and pass down the values that had sustained us through our darkest times. People often ask me if I regret not taking Lily to town that first day, if I regret keeping her with me through that winter instead of immediately trying to find her relatives. And my answer is always the same. I don't believe in regrets. I believe in providence, everything that happened. The attack on the wagon train, Lily escaping into the wilderness, me finding her on that exact day, in that exact place, the fake sheriff revealing himself. Our journey to San Francisco, all of it was meant to be. I was meant to find her because I was the one person stubborn enough to protect her, isolated enough to hide her, loyal enough to love her without conditions. And she was meant to find me because I needed her just as much as she needed me. I just didn't know it until I heard her crying behind that fallen tree on a frozen February morning in 1902. The locket that had started everything, the locket that had contained her mother's secret and nearly cost Lily her life, still hung around her neck, but now it held different photographs. Her own daughter Margaret, her husband me, the family she had built from the ashes of tragedy. She had told me once that she would never take it off, that it was her connection to the past and her promise to the future, a reminder that love and sacrifice were the only things that really mattered in this world. And looking back on everything that had happened, on all the miles we had traveled and all the dangers we had faced, I knew she was right, that simple truth had guided us through the wilderness, both the wilderness of those Wyoming mountains and the wilderness of grief and loss and fear. We had survived because we had each other. We had thrived because we chose love over bitterness, hope over despair, family over solitude. And in the end, that was the real secret in the locket. Not a bank certificate worth $20,000, but the knowledge that some bonds transcend blood and circumstance, some families are chosen rather than born, and some love stories begin not with romance, but with a trapper hearing a child's cry and deciding in that instant that some souls are worth saving no matter the cost. That was my story, the story of how a 7-year-old girl taught a 43-year-old man what it meant to truly live. The story of how a piece of jewelry nearly destroyed us and ultimately saved us. The story of how sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest act of compassion. But the story didn't end there, not really. Because life has a way of circling back to teach us lessons we thought we had already learned. 3 years after Lily opened her school in Laramie, when she was 20 years old and I was 53, something happened that brought everything full circle in a way I never could have anticipated. I was in town picking up supplies when a young man approached me outside the general store. He was thin, nervous, probably no more than 19 or 20, and he kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "Are you Samuel Bridger?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am. What's this about?" "My name is Daniel Kane. I'm Victor Kane's son, And before you reach for that rifle, I need you to know I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to ask for your forgiveness." I didn't reach for my rifle, but my hand moved instinctively closer to it. Victor Kane had been hanged 15 years earlier for his crimes. For murdering innocent people, including Lily's mother. For hunting a child across half the country. And now his son was standing in front of me, asking for forgiveness. "What makes you think I have any forgiveness to give you?" I asked. "Because I know what my father did," Daniel said, his eyes filling with tears. "I know about the wagon train, about the little girl, about all of it. And I've spent the last 3 years trying to make amends for crimes I didn't commit, but that carry my family name." He told me his story, how he had been only 4 years old when his father turned to crime, how he had grown up in orphanages after his father's execution, how he had learned the truth about Victor Kane's actions when he was 16 and had been consumed by shame ever since. He had tracked down every family affected by his father's crimes, had worked odd jobs to save money to give them, had dedicated his life to trying to balance the scales, even though he knew it was impossible. "I came to Laramie to find Lily Harrison," he said. "I have money saved. It's not much, but I want to give it to her school, to help children who lost their parents the way she lost her mother, the way I lost my father, even though he didn't deserve to be called a father." There was something genuine in his desperation, something that reminded me of Lily when I had first found her, that same need to be seen as more than the worst thing that had happened to them. "Come with me," I told him. "There's someone you need to meet." We walked to Lily's school together, a 3-story building on the edge of town that housed 23 children ranging from ages 5 to 15. Lily had used her inheritance wisely, creating not just a place for orphans to sleep, but a real home where they could heal and grow and become whoever they were meant to be. She was in the garden with some of the younger children when we arrived, teaching them how to plant vegetables. And when she looked up and saw me with Daniel, her expression changed immediately. She had her mother's intuition, that ability to sense when something significant was about to happen. "This is Daniel Kane," I told her, "Victor Kane's son. He wants to talk to you." I watched her face carefully, waiting for anger or fear or pain, but what I saw instead was something I should have expected from the woman she had become: curiosity and compassion. The children scattered to play while Lily, Daniel, and I sat on a wooden bench under an old cottonwood tree. Daniel repeated his story, his voice shaking, his hands trembling, and when he was finished, he pulled out a worn leather pouch. "I have $217 here," he said. "It's everything I've saved over the past 3 years. I want you to have it for the school. It won't bring your mother back. It won't undo what my father did. But maybe it can help one child have a better life." Lily took the pouch, but she didn't open it. She just held it in her hands, looking at this young man who carried a burden he hadn't created. "Daniel," she said gently, "I can't take this money." His face crumpled. "Please, I need to do something. I can't just—" "Stop," she interrupted. "I can't take this money because you need it more than I do. You're trying to pay for sins that aren't yours. Trying to carry guilt that doesn't belong to you, and that's not how healing works. But I'm his son. His blood runs through my veins. How can I not be responsible?" "You're responsible for your own choices," Lily said, "not for his. My mother taught me that before she died. She taught me that we define ourselves by what we do, not by what was done to us or by who our parents were." Daniel looked confused, like he had been preparing for rejection and didn't know how to handle acceptance. "What am I supposed to do then?" he asked. "Live your own life," Lily said. "Make your own choices. Be your own man. If you want to help people, do it because it's who you are, not because you're trying to erase who your father was." She handed the pouch back to him, but he wouldn't take it, so she made him a different offer. "Work here," she said. I need help with repairs around the building, with teaching the older boys carpentry and practical skills. I can't pay much, but I can offer you room and board and a chance to do good work with a clean conscience." Daniel started working at the school the next day and over the following months. I watched him transform from a young man, crushed by inherited shame, into someone who understood that redemption wasn't about paying debts, but about choosing differently. The children loved him, especially the boys who needed a male figure to look up to. And Lily saw in him what I had seen in her all those years ago, someone worthy of a second chance. But the situation created complications I hadn't anticipated. People in town who remembered Victor Kane's crimes were not happy to learn his son was working at Lily's school. There were complaints, threats, angry letters demanding Daniel be fired. Lily faced a choice. She could give in to public pressure and protect her school's reputation, or she could stand by her principles and risk everything she had built. She chose principles. She held a town meeting and addressed the concerns directly. She stood in front of over 100 people and told them Daniel's story, told them about forgiveness and second chances, reminded them that many of the children in her school were there because their parents had made mistakes or had been victims of other people's mistakes, and asked them if they really wanted to live in a world where children paid for their parents' sins forever. It was the most powerful speech I ever heard. By the end half, the audience was crying, including some of the men who had come ready to run Daniel out of town. It didn't change everyone's mind, but it changed enough minds that Daniel was allowed to stay. And something else happened too. The controversy brought attention to the school, and donations started arriving from all over Wyoming and beyond. People who admired Lily's courage, who believed in her message of redemption. The school expanded, adding another building, taking in more children, hiring additional teachers. And Daniel became Lily's right-hand man, the person she trusted to handle the daily operations, while she focused on fundraising and advocacy for orphan welfare across the entire territory. I watched their relationship develop with mixed feelings. On one hand, I was proud of Lily for seeing past Daniel's last name and recognizing his character. On the other hand, I worried that she was getting too close to the son of the man who had killed her mother, that maybe some wounds were too deep to allow that kind of connection. My concerns were confirmed one evening when Lily came to visit me at my cabin. She was 22 now. Daniel was 21, and I knew from her expression what she was about to tell me before she said a word. "I love him," she said simply. "I love Daniel, and he loves me. And before you say anything, I need you to know that I've thought about this from every angle. I know who his father was. I know what people will say. I know how complicated this is, but none of that changes how I feel." "How does he feel about all this?" I asked. "Terrified," she said with a small smile. "He thinks he doesn't deserve me. Thinks that being with him would dishonor my mother's memory. But I told him that honoring my mother's memory means choosing love over hate, forgiveness over vengeance, hope over fear. Everything she taught me in the short time we had together. I couldn't argue with that logic because it was exactly what I had tried to teach her too. But still I had to ask, are you absolutely certain about this? Certain enough to face the judgment, the whispers, the people who will never understand. "Yes," she said, "because I learned from the best. I learned from you that sometimes the most important thing you can do is choose family, even when it doesn't make sense to anyone else. You chose me when you could have turned me over to authorities. You protected me when it would have been easier to walk away. You loved me even though I wasn't your blood. How could I do anything less for Daniel?" She had a point. My whole relationship with Lily was built on choosing connection over convention, love over logic, and now she was doing the same thing, extending that same grace to someone else who needed it. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the school with the children as witnesses. Some people in town boycotted the wedding. Others came to show their support. But what mattered was that Lily and Daniel stood together in front of everyone and chose each other despite everything that should have kept them apart. I gave her away, walking her down the makeshift aisle in the school's main hall. And when I placed her hand in Daniel's, I whispered, "You hurt her, and I don't care whose son you are. I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." He looked me in the eye and said, "If I ever hurt her, I'll save you the trouble and turn myself in. But that's never going to happen, because she's the reason. I believe in redemption, and I'm going to spend every day of my life being worthy of that belief." They had 3 children together over the next 7 years, 2 boys and a girl. And watching their family grow was like watching a miracle unfold in slow motion. Here was Lily, the orphan child I had found in the wilderness, creating her own family with the son of the man who had made her an orphan. It was the kind of poetic justice that seemed too perfect to be real, and yet there it was happening right in front of me. But life has a way of testing our convictions, of asking us if we really believe what we say we believe, or if we're just saying words that sound good. That test came when Lily's youngest daughter, Margaret, turned 7 years old, the same age Lily had been when I found her. The girl had inherited her mother's gray eyes and her grandmother's strength. But she had also inherited something else, a medical condition that caused seizures, sometimes mild, sometimes severe enough to be life-threatening. The local doctor in Laramie said there was nothing he could do, that Margaret would likely not live to see her 10th birthday. But Lily refused to accept that. She had survived impossible odds, had overcome tragedy that would have broken most people, and she was not going to lose her daughter without a fight. She researched every medical journal she could find, wrote letters to doctors in New York and Boston and San Francisco, spent countless hours trying to find someone who could help, and finally she found a specialist in Denver who thought he might be able to treat Margaret's condition with a new experimental procedure. The problem was the procedure cost $500. More money than Lily and Daniel had saved, more than they could reasonably raise in the time they had. And even though Lily still had access to her trust fund from her mother, she had never touched it. After using the initial amount to establish the school, she had always said that money was meant for helping orphans, not for personal use. And she struggled with the decision of whether to use it now for her own daughter. I went to visit her the night before she was supposed to make her decision. Found her sitting in her office at the school, surrounded by financial records and medical papers, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "Use the money," I told her. "Use it. Your mother left it to you to use as you saw fit. She wouldn't want you to let your daughter die because of some principle about how the money should be spent. But those children," Lily gestured around the school, "they need this place. If I drain the trust fund, what happens to them? The school is established now. It has donors. It will survive. But Margaret won't survive if you don't do this. Your mother would understand. She gave her life to save you. Do you think she would hesitate for 1 second to use money to save her granddaughter?" Lily started crying, not the quiet tears I had seen from her before, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very center of her soul. "I'm so tired of losing people," she said. "I lost my mother. I lost everyone on that wagon train. I've lost children who came through the school sick or broken. I can't lose Margaret too. I can't." "You won't," I told her, "because you're going to use that money and save your daughter the same way your mother saved you. This isn't betraying your principles. This is honoring them. Family first, always family first." She used the money, took Margaret to Denver, stayed there for 3 months while the specialist performed the procedure and Margaret recovered. And when they came back to Laramie, Margaret was healthier than she had ever been. The seizures had stopped, the color had returned to her face, and she was full of the energy and joy that every 7-year-old should have. The school survived, just as I had predicted. Donors rallied when they heard about Margaret's illness. Contributions increased, and the trust fund was eventually replenished through the generosity of people who believed in what Lily was building. It was a reminder that sometimes we have to trust that the safety net we've built for ourselves will hold when we take the leap to save someone we love. Years continued to pass. I grew older. My hair turned completely white. My joints ached in the winter. And I spent more time sitting on my porch, watching the mountains than I did climbing them. Lily and Daniel brought the grandchildren to visit regularly. And each time I saw how much they had all grown, how much life had changed since that frozen February morning in 1902. Daniel had become a respected member of the community. People no longer saw him as Victor Kane's son, but as Daniel, the man who ran the orphan school, the man who had raised 3 good children, the man who had proven that we are defined by our choices, not our bloodlines. Lily had become something of a legend in Wyoming. The woman who had survived a massacre as a child and dedicated her life to helping other children survive their own tragedies. She was invited to speak at churches and community gatherings. She advised the territorial government on child welfare policies. And she never forgot where she came from or the man who had given her a chance at life. On my 60th birthday, they threw me a surprise party at the school. All the children were there, along with townspeople I had known for years. People whose lives had been touched by Lily's work, and by extension, by my decision to keep her that winter instead of immediately taking her to town. They gave speeches about how my choice had created ripples that spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. How one act of compassion had led to a school that had helped hundreds of children. How Lily's story had inspired people across the territory to be more generous, more forgiving, more willing to see the potential in lost causes. It was overwhelming and humbling, and I found myself fighting back tears as I listened to them talk about me like I was some kind of hero when all I had done was refuse to leave a child to freeze in the wilderness. That night, after everyone had gone home, Lily stayed behind to help me clean up. We worked in comfortable silence, washing dishes, folding tables, sweeping floors, and when we were finished, she sat down across from me and pulled something from her pocket. "I want you to have this," she said, placing the locket in my hand. The same locket that had started everything. The locket that had nearly gotten her killed. The locket she had worn every single day for the past 25 years. "I can't take this," I said. "This is your connection to your mother. And you're my connection to survival." She said, "To hope, to the life I've built. That locket represents my past, and it's precious to me. But you represent my future, and that's even more precious. I want you to hold on to it so that when I need to remember where I came from, when I need to remember the lessons my mother and you taught me, I can come visit you, and we can look at it together." I opened the locket. Inside were the photographs I remembered. Her mother, Margaret, but also new ones that had been added over the years. Her children, Daniel, me. A whole family tree that had grown from tragedy into something beautiful. "This is your legacy," I told her. "Everyone in this locket, everyone at that school, everyone whose life you've touched. This is what came from your mother's sacrifice and my decision to bring you home." "No," Lily said gently. "This is what came from love. From people choosing to love even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense, even when the world says it's impossible. My mother loved me enough to die for me. You loved me enough to protect me. I loved Daniel enough to forgive his father's crimes. We all chose love, and this is the result." We sat there for a long time, an old man and the woman who had become his daughter in every way that mattered, looking at a small locket that contained the entire story of how broken things can be mended if we're willing to do the work. The next morning I walked out to my porch with my coffee and sat in my usual chair watching the sun rise over the mountains. I had lived in these mountains for over 40 years. had seen seasons change, animals come and go, had witnessed the slow transformation of wilderness into civilization. But none of those changes compared to the transformation I had experienced because of one little girl crying behind a fallen tree. I thought about that day often, about how easily I could have missed her. If I had checked my traps on a different route, if I had been listening to the wind instead of the silence, if I had been a man who minded his own business instead of someone who paid attention to sounds that didn't belong, Lily would have frozen to death, and none of the ripples would have happened. No school, no saved children, no redemption for Daniel, no legacy of love conquering hate. It was a sobering thought. How much of life comes down to chance, to being in the right place at the right time, to making the right choice when it matters most. But I also thought about what Lily had said about Providence, about how everything was meant to be. And maybe she was right. Maybe I was supposed to find her. Maybe she was supposed to teach me how to live again. Maybe all of it was part of a bigger pattern that we can only see when we look back. I spent my final years in that cabin. My health declining, but my spirit strong. Lily visited weekly, sometimes with Daniel and the grandchildren, sometimes alone when she needed to talk through a problem at the school or just sit quietly with someone who understood her history. We would sit on that porch for hours, not always talking, sometimes just existing together in the comfortable silence of two people who had been through hell and come out the other side holding hands. When I was 65, I got sick, nothing dramatic. Just the slow failing of an old body that had lived hard and was ready to rest. The doctor said I had maybe 6 months, maybe less. And I accepted it with the same calm I had accepted everything else in my life. Lily wanted me to come stay at her house in town so she could take care of me, but I refused. I wanted to die in my cabin, in the mountains that had been my home, surrounded by the peace I had found after leaving Philadelphia all those years ago. She respected my wishes, but she came every day, bringing food, checking on me, reading to me when my eyes got too weak to read for myself. And we spent those final months reviewing our life together, telling stories, laughing at memories, crying over losses, celebrating victories. One evening, when I was particularly weak, struggling to breathe, struggling to hold on to consciousness, Lily sat beside my bed holding my hand. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know I shouldn't be. I know you're ready, but I'm scared of losing you." "Don't be scared," I told her. "You're not losing me. You're just letting me go to be with your mother. I need to thank her personally for pushing you out of that wagon, for giving me the greatest gift I ever received." She smiled through her tears. "What should I tell the children about you? Tell them I was a trapper who learned too late that the best things to trap in this life are moments, memories, and love. Tell them I found a little girl in the wilderness, and she saved my life just as much as I saved hers. Tell them that family isn't about blood. It's about choice, and I chose them just like I chose you." I died 3 days later, with Lily holding one hand and Daniel holding the other, with the locket around my neck that Lily had given me, with my grandchildren singing softly in the next room, with the peace of knowing that my life had mattered, that my choices had created something lasting, that the scared little girl I had found 27 years earlier had become a woman who would carry forward the lessons we had learned together. They buried me in a small cemetery outside Laramie, next to a plot Lily had already purchased for herself and Daniel. On my headstone, they carved the words Samuel Bridger, trapper, father, friend. He found lost things. And below that a small engraving of a locket. Years after I was gone, Lily continued her work. The school thrived and expanded. She opened 2 more locations in neighboring territories. She trained other teachers in her methods of healing traumatized children through love and structure. She became an advocate for child welfare legislation that protected orphans across the West. Daniel remained by her side through it all, proving every day that people can transcend their origins, that sons don't have to become their fathers, that love really can conquer the darkest family histories. Their children grew up, had children of their own, and the story of the trapper and the lost girl became family legend, told and retold at gatherings, teaching new generations about courage, forgiveness, providence, and the power of choosing love even when it seems impossible. Margaret, the granddaughter who had nearly died at 7 but survived thanks to her mother's trust fund, grew up to become a doctor. She specialized in treating children with seizure disorders, dedicating her life to saving others the way she had been saved. And on her office wall, she hung a photograph of her mother as a child standing next to an old trapper on a mountain porch, both smiling at the camera, both knowing they had survived something most people couldn't imagine. Lily lived to be 73 years old. She died peacefully in her sleep in the same house where she had raised her children, surrounded by 3 generations of family. And in her hand she was clutching that locket, the locket that had started everything, the locket that had nearly killed her and ultimately saved her, the locket that contained photographs of everyone she had loved. At her funeral, people came from all over Wyoming and beyond, former students from the school, now grown with families of their own, politicians who had worked with her on child welfare legislation, teachers she had trained, families she had helped. And they all told stories about how Lily Harrison had touched their lives, how she had seen potential in them when no one else did, how she had taught them that their past didn't define their future. Daniel spoke last, now an old man himself, 72 years old, white-haired and bent, but still strong in spirit. He stood at the front of the church and told the truth about who Lily had been. "She saved my life," he said, "not just by giving me a job or believing in me, but by teaching me that I was more than my father's crimes, by showing me that redemption wasn't something you earned through suffering, but something you accepted through grace. She loved me when I didn't deserve it, believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and gave me a family when I thought I would spend my whole life alone. And the most remarkable thing about Lily was that she did this for everyone. Every child who came through her school, every person who asked for help, every soul who needed to believe that they could be more than their worst moment." After the funeral, Daniel went to the cemetery and stood between Lily's grave and mine, placing flowers on both, and he stayed there for hours, talking to us, thanking us, telling us about the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, promising that he would keep the school running, that he would make sure our story wasn't forgotten. The locket was passed down through the family, each generation adding new photographs, new memories, new chapters to the story. And it became more than just a piece of jewelry. It became a symbol of what happens when people choose love over fear, forgiveness over vengeance, hope over despair. Someone once asked Margaret, Lily's granddaughter, why her family kept adding to the locket instead of just preserving it as it was, and her answer was perfect. "Because the story isn't over," she said. "The story continues with every child we help, every person we forgive, every time we choose to see potential instead of problems." My great-grandmother Margaret Harrison started this story by sacrificing herself for her daughter. Samuel Bridger continued it by choosing to protect that daughter. My grandmother Lily expanded it by dedicating her life to helping others. And now it's our responsibility to keep it going. And they did keep it going. The school that Lily founded continued operating for over 100 years, eventually becoming a model for child welfare institutions across the country. The lessons she taught about trauma-informed care, about seeing children as individuals rather than problems, about the power of stable, loving environments. These lessons influenced generations of social workers and educators. The story of the trapper and the lost girl became part of Wyoming folklore, told in schools, written about in history books, adapted into plays, and eventually a film. But more importantly, it became a touchstone for people who needed to believe that terrible things don't have to define us, that tragedy can be transformed into purpose, that one person's decision to help can create ripples that last for generations. But there was another chapter to this story, one that didn't come to light until 70 years after I found Lily in those mountains. A chapter that revealed just how interconnected our lives really were, and how the choices we make echo through time in ways we can never fully predict. It was 1972 when a historian named Robert Chun came to Wyoming, researching the wagon train massacres of the early 1900s for his doctoral dissertation. He had heard rumors about the Harrison case, about a child who survived and went on to do remarkable things, and he wanted to document it properly. By then Daniel had been dead for 5 years, Lily had been gone for 3, and most of the original witnesses to our story had passed on. But Margaret, Lily's granddaughter, who had become a doctor, was still alive at 77 years old, sharp as ever, and she agreed to meet with Robert and share everything she knew. They met at the old school building, which had been converted into a museum dedicated to Lily's life and work. And as Margaret walked Robert through the exhibits, showing him photographs and documents and artifacts from those early days, Robert kept stopping at one particular photo, the one of me and Lily on the cabin porch that hung in Margaret's office. "There's something familiar about this man," Robert said, pointing at my image. "Do you know his full name?" "Samuel Bridger." Margaret told him. "He was my grandmother's adoptive father, the man who found her after the massacre and raised her." Robert pulled out a worn folder from his briefcase and started flipping through old documents. Census records, military enlistment papers, newspaper clippings, and then he stopped, his face going pale. "I think I need to sit down," he said. Margaret led him to a bench and waited while he composed himself. Finally, he looked up at her with an expression of absolute astonishment. "Samuel Bridger wasn't just a random trapper who happened to find your grandmother," he said. "He was the soldier who saved Victor Kane's life during the Indian Wars in 1885. Margaret didn't understand at first. The connection seemed impossible, too coincidental to be real. But Robert showed her the documents, military records indicating that Private Samuel Bridger had pulled Corporal Victor Kane from a burning wagon during a skirmish with bandits near Fort Laramie, had carried him to safety despite being wounded himself, had stayed with him during his recovery. There was even a commendation letter praising Samuel's bravery and noting that Kane surely would have died without his intervention. "So you're telling me," Margaret said slowly, "that Samuel saved the life of the man who would later murder my great-grandmother and hunt my grandmother across half the country?" "Yes," Robert said, "and there's more. According to these records, Kane and Bridger were actually friends for several years after that. They served together, corresponded after Samuel left the army. Kane even visited Samuel's cabin once in 1888. Margaret felt like the ground was shifting beneath her. Everything she thought she knew about the story was being rewritten. The random chance of Samuel finding Lily suddenly seemed less random. The providence her grandmother had always talked about took on a darker, more complicated dimension. "Did Samuel know?" Margaret asked. "When Kane came to the cabin pretending to be a sheriff, did Samuel recognize him?" Robert pulled out another document, a personal journal that had been found in Victor Kane's possessions after his execution. In it, Kane had written extensively about his crimes, his motivations, his regrets. And there was a passage dated 2 weeks before he showed up at Samuel's cabin that made everything clear. Kane had written, "I know where the girl is. One of my informants told me she's living with a trapper north of Laramie, a man named Bridger, and when I heard that name, I nearly laughed at the irony. Samuel Bridger, the man who saved my life 17 years ago. The man who told me after pulling me from that burning wagon that I owed him nothing, because that's what good men do. They help without expecting repayment. Well, now he has something I need, and I'm going to take it, because I'm not a good man anymore. I haven't been for a long time. Samuel won't recognize me. I've changed too much, aged badly. The drink and the violence have worn me down. But even if he does recognize me, I don't think he'll give up the girl. He always was stubborn about doing what he thought was right, which means I'll probably have to kill him too, another debt I'll never be able to repay. Margaret's hands were shaking as she read the passage. Samuel had known, maybe not consciously at first, but some part of him must have recognized Cain, or at least sensed the connection. And he had still chosen to protect Lily, had still risked everything to save the daughter of people Cain had murdered, had still loved her and raised her knowing that doing so meant standing against a man whose life he had once saved. It changes everything, Margaret said, and nothing. The story is still the same, but now I understand why Samuel never talked about his past, why he seemed to carry some deep sadness even in his happiest moments. He wasn't just a hermit who preferred mountains to people. He was a man who had saved a monster and spent the rest of his life trying to atone for it by saving the monster's victim. Robert disagreed gently. I don't think Samuel saw it as atonement. I think he saw it as choosing differently. He saved Cain because that's what you do in war. You save your brothers in arms. But when Cain became someone who murdered innocent people, Samuel made a different choice. He chose to save Lily, not to make up for saving Cain, but because saving people was who he was. He didn't see it as balancing scales. He saw it as doing the right thing twice. Once in 1885, and again in 1902. They spent the rest of the day going through more documents. And Robert uncovered other connections that had been hidden for decades. He found letters between Samuel and Cain from the late 1880s showing a genuine friendship. Discussions about their war experiences, their hopes for the future, their struggles to adapt to civilian life. In one letter from 1889, Cain had written to Samuel about his dismissal from the Pinkerton agency, about how he felt betrayed by a system that demanded results, but punished the methods required to get those results. And Samuel had written back with advice that was both compassionate and prophetic. Victor, I understand your anger, but you need to be careful about letting that anger define you. I've seen what happens to men who can't let go of their rage. They become the very thing they're fighting against. You're better than that. You can choose to be better than that. Cain had never responded to that letter. And 6 months later, the first reports of his criminal activities began to surface: robberies, extortion, violence, a steady descent into the darkness that would eventually lead to the wagon train massacre and his own execution. Margaret realized that Samuel must have known about Cain's crimes, must have seen the wanted posters, must have understood that his old friend had become exactly the kind of man he had warned him not to become. And then suddenly Cain had appeared at his cabin, asking about a little girl with a locket. And Samuel had to make an impossible choice: loyalty to an old friend who had saved his life in return, or protection of an innocent child. He chose the child, Margaret said. He always chose love over loyalty to evil. Yes, Robert agreed, but I don't think it was easy for him. These letters showed genuine affection between them. Samuel really cared about Cain at one point, which makes his decision to stand against him even more meaningful. He didn't protect Lily because Cain was a stranger. He protected her despite Cain being someone he had once considered a brother. This revelation cast new light on everything. Suddenly, Samuel's reluctance to talk about his military service made sense. His isolation in the mountains took on new meaning. His fierce protection of Lily seemed even more significant. He had been living with the knowledge that he had saved a man who became a killer, and then fate had given him a chance to save that killer's victim. It was the kind of cosmic symmetry that seemed too perfect to be coincidental, but too tragic to be planned. Margaret asked Robert to keep this information quiet. She didn't want it to overshadow Lily's legacy or complicate the simple, beautiful story that had inspired so many people. But Robert convinced her that the truth made the story more powerful, not less, because it showed that even our mistakes, even our most well-intentioned actions that lead to unintended consequences, can be redeemed through subsequent choices. They decided to publish the full story, including Samuel's connection to Cain. And when the book came out in 1974, it caused a sensation. People were fascinated by the complexity, by the moral ambiguity, by the idea that heroes aren't people who never make mistakes, but people who keep choosing good even after their previous good choices have been twisted into something terrible. The book led to renewed interest in Lily's schools, which by then had become a network of child welfare institutions across 7 states. Donations increased, new programs were established, and Samuel's full story became part of the curriculum, used to teach children about the complexity of moral choices, about how we can't always predict the consequences of our actions, but we can always choose to do the next right thing. Margaret lived another 12 years after the book was published. She spent those years traveling to schools and institutions that had been inspired by her grandmother's work, telling the complete story, answering questions, helping people understand that redemption is never simple, that good people can make choices that lead to bad outcomes, that bad people can be saved by good people who later regret saving them, and that none of this changes the fundamental truth that choosing love and protection over hate and violence is always the right decision. Before Margaret died in 1986 at the age of 91, she added one final photograph to the locket. It was a picture of Robert Chun standing in front of the museum dedicated to Lily's work, and on the back she had written, "To the man who revealed the full truth and showed us that complicated stories are more valuable than simple ones, that flawed heroes are more inspiring than perfect ones, and that the measure of a life isn't whether we make mistakes, but whether we keep choosing love despite the mistakes we've made." The locket eventually ended up in the Smithsonian Institution as part of an exhibit on the American West. But before it was donated, every living descendant of Lily and Daniel had the opportunity to hold it, to look through the photographs, to connect with the story of how one terrible day in 1902 led to generations of healing and hope. Among those descendants was a young woman named Sarah, Lily's great-great-granddaughter, who at 19 years old was struggling with her own demons. Addiction, trauma from an abusive relationship, a sense that she was fundamentally broken and beyond help. She had heard the family stories, of course. Everyone in the family knew about Lily and Samuel, but she had always dismissed them as fairy tales, old stories that had nothing to do with her modern problems. But when she held the locket and looked at the photographs, something shifted inside her. She saw Lily as a 7-year-old orphan who had every reason to give up. She saw Samuel as a man haunted by his past choices who could have stayed isolated but chose connection instead. She saw Daniel, who could have let his father's crimes define him, but chose to be different. She saw Margaret, who could have died at 7, but fought to live, and then spent her life saving others. And she realized that she was part of this lineage of survival, that the same strength that had carried them through their darkest moments was available to her if she chose to access it. Sarah checked herself into rehab the next day. She began the long, hard work of recovery, of therapy, of rebuilding her life one choice at a time. And 3 years later, when she graduated from college with a degree in social work, she sent a letter to the Smithsonian asking if she could see the locket one more time before beginning her career. They arranged a private viewing, and Sarah stood in a quiet room in the museum, holding the locket that had started everything, looking at faces of people she had never met, but who had shaped who she was. And she added her own promise to the chain of promises that had been made over the decades. She promised to honor their legacy by helping others the way they had helped others, by choosing love over fear, forgiveness over vengeance, hope over despair, by being living proof that trauma doesn't have to be a dead end, that it can be transformed into purpose if we're willing to do the work. Sarah went on to establish a program specifically for young women recovering from addiction and abuse. She used the principles Lily had developed in her schools: trauma-informed care, stable, loving environments, belief in potential rather than focus on problems. And her program became one of the most successful in the country, with a recovery rate that far exceeded national averages. When asked in interviews what inspired her work, Sarah always told the story of the trapper and the lost girl, but she told the complete version, including Samuel's connection to Cain, including the moral complexity, including the fact that doing good doesn't guarantee good outcomes, but is still worth doing. She emphasized that Samuel couldn't have known that saving Cain in 1885 would indirectly lead to the deaths of innocent people 17 years later. But when faced with that terrible knowledge, he didn't spiral into guilt or inaction. He made a different choice. He saved Lily. And that choice created ripples that were still spreading almost a century later. The story became even more relevant in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as people grappled with questions of moral responsibility, of unintended consequences, of how to live ethically in a complicated world where good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. Samuel and Lily's story provided a framework for thinking about these issues, not by offering easy answers, but by showing that we're defined not by the purity of our choices, but by our willingness to keep choosing good even when previous choices have led to pain. In 2002, exactly 100 years after I found Lily in those mountains, the family organized a centennial celebration at the original site of my cabin, which had been preserved as a historic landmark. Descendants came from all over the country, over 200 people, all connected by blood or by the work that Lily had started, all carrying pieces of the story forward into a new century. They gathered in a meadow near where the cabin still stood, and one by one they told stories about how the legacy had touched their lives. Teachers who used Lily's methods in their classrooms, social workers who applied her principles in their practice, parents who raised their children with the values she had modeled, people who had been through trauma and found hope in knowing that survival was possible. That thriving after tragedy was not just possible but achievable. The keynote speaker was a man named Marcus, who had come through one of Lily's schools in 1947 when he was 9 years old. He was 84 now, a retired judge, and he spoke about how Lily had visited the school regularly, even in her 70s, how she had taken special interest in him because he reminded her of herself, angry and scared and convinced that he was unlovable. She told me something I've never forgotten. Marcus said, his voice carrying across the meadow, she told me that being broken isn't the same as being worthless. That cracks are where the light gets in, that the most beautiful pottery is kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken ceramics with gold so that the breaks become part of the beauty rather than something to hide. She said her life had been kintsugi, broken by tragedy but repaired with love. And the gold that held her together was every person who had chosen to see her potential instead of her problems. Starting with Samuel Bridger, who found her in the wilderness and refused to let her freeze. The celebration lasted all day, ending with a ceremony at sunset where they released 100 white doves, one for each year since that frozen morning in February 1902. And as the birds rose into the sky against the backdrop of the Wyoming mountains, everyone present felt the weight of connection, of being part of something larger than themselves, of carrying forward a story that mattered. That night, after everyone else had left, Sarah stayed behind at the cabin, now preserved but empty, and she sat on the porch where Samuel and Lily had sat together so many times, where they had processed their trauma, celebrated their victories, built their relationship, chosen each other as family. And she imagined what that first winter must have been like. A middle-aged trapper and a traumatized child, both so alone, both so in need of connection, both so afraid of being hurt again, learning to trust each other, learning to be a family. She thought about all the moments that had led to her being alive. If Samuel had checked his traps on a different route, if he had ignored Lily's crying, if he had turned her over to the fake sheriff, if Cain had succeeded in taking her, if any of 1,000 small choices had gone differently, none of the subsequent generations would exist. Not Daniel's children, not their children, not Sarah herself. Her entire existence depended on a choice made by a man she never met to save a girl. He didn't know on a day when it would have been easier to walk away. And that, Sarah realized, was the real secret in the locket. Not the bank certificate that had nearly gotten Lily killed, but the deeper truth that our lives are interconnected in ways we can never fully understand. That small acts of kindness can cascade through time. That choosing to help one person can change the world in ways we'll never see. That we're all part of an ongoing story that started long before we were born and will continue long after we're gone. She stayed on that porch until the stars came out. The same stars Samuel had looked at on his final night. The same stars Lily had made wishes on as a child. The same stars that had witnessed everything, the tragedy and the triumph, the pain and the healing, the mistakes and the redemptions. And under those ancient lights, Sarah made a promise, not just to honor the legacy, but to add to it, to be someone's Samuel Bridger, to find lost people and help them become found, to choose love even when it's complicated, to believe in redemption even when it seems impossible, to be living proof that the story never ends. It just keeps growing, keeps expanding, keeps pulling new people into its orbit, keeps demonstrating that one person's choice to help can echo through generations, creating ripples that spread far beyond what anyone could imagine on that frozen morning in February 1902, when a trapper heard a sound that didn't belong and decided to investigate, decided to care, decided to save a life, and in doing so created a legacy that would outlive him by more than a century.